What do you think are some of the leading causes of this insane spike in autoimmunity over the last 50 or so years?
Short answer is the modern lifestyle. Our immune systems did not evolve in an environment where we had many of those threats put together. We just can't avoid some level of exposure at this point. If you look at the history of medicine, it's like the history of most people being wrong about most things most of the time. We laugh about the misconceptions and ideas that we had 100 years ago. They, in turn, looked back 100 years and laughed and chuckled, and yet somehow we think it's different now. I think it's that deep in our nervous system that to challenge the status quo is actually in some way a threat to our own survival. It rarely is, but it's perceived that way. I think that's what makes it challenging.
Chris, what's happening? Welcome to the Meat Mafia podcast. Pleasure to have you.
Oh, it's great to be here, guys. Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
Yeah, we're really excited for this. And I know we were talking a little bit before we hit record, but Chris, one of our favorite parts of this show is getting to have guests on the podcast that have had a personal influence on both of our health journeys. And I would say you absolutely fit the bill. Your blog posts and a lot of the content and information that you put out has been super informative for both Harry and I with our respective health journeys. I think I was saying to you when I was going through my journey, trying to treat ulcerative colitis holistically through diet and lifestyle changes, the blog posts and a lot of the content that you've put out over the years is just like a wealth of knowledge and was super impactful on both of us. So we're super appreciative of you taking the time to join us here today.
Oh, I'm happy that I've been able to help in some small way, and yeah, looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, Chris, one of the things I was thinking about to kick off the conversation, something we've publicly spoken about a lot was just the cost that some of these autoimmune diseases have on the United States. I did the calculations. I was on a immunosuppressant drug called Remicade for about 6 years. And so I cost the US medical system $2.4 million personally. And I was doing some numbers. I saw that about 50 million Americans have an autoimmune disease currently. And that was absolutely astonishing, especially when you look at a graph and see how these things have exponentially increased over time. And, I guess part one is, do you think that 50 million person number is accurate? And secondly, what do you think are some of the leading causes of this insane spike in autoimmunity over the last 50 or so years?
Well, the short answer is the modern lifestyle. And we can unpack that, but that's definitely the summary. And when you look into that, take a couple steps down, you've got diet as a huge factor, of course, and we now know that 60% of the calories the average American consumes come from not just processed foods, but ultra processed foods. So that's essentially like flour, sugar, and industrial seed oils comprise, nearly 60% of calories that Americans eat today. And those foods wreak havoc on the gut microbiome. They feed harmful bacteria and let those bacteria proliferate. That then can lead to leaky gut, intestinal permeability, which then provokes a systemic hyperactive immune response. And that's, of course, autoimmunity in a nutshell. So that's a major factor. Lack of exercise dysregulates the immune system. Not getting enough sleep is a huge immune disruptor. Chronic stress has a big impact on the immune system. The proliferation of environmental toxins, whether we're talking about heavy metals like lead, mercury, arsenic, cadmium, or pesticides and herbicides, glyphosate being a notorious example. Chemicals like BPA, bisphenol A, things that are found in plastics, which or phthalates or PFAS, like these chemicals are now ubiquitous in our environment, and even despite our best efforts, it's virtually impossible to avoid them completely because there are no hard boundaries in the environment where these chemicals can just be contained. So even if you buy organic food and you're certainly that's for sure desirable and worth doing, and there's going to be a lot less of those chemicals in those foods than there would be in conventional alternatives. But it is true that we just can't avoid some level of exposure at this point. So when you put all those things together, it basically creates a set of threats to the immune system that the immune system just can't withstand. Our immune systems did not evolve in an environment where we had all, many of those threats, certainly not all of them put together. And, it can start from very early on, even in utero. When you combine the genetic predisposition, which is heritable, of course, that's passed down to subsequent generations, and then those environmental triggers, on top of that genetic predispositions, you have a pretty potent recipe for autoimmune disease. And as you pointed out, 50 million Americans, so that's 1 in 6. I've seen some estimates that suggest 1 in 4 women may have an autoimmune disease now. There are over 80 autoimmune diseases that have been defined, with that number going up significantly every year. There's a growing understanding that diseases that were not necessarily traditionally thought of as autoimmune may have autoimmune elements. So just like the more we learn about it, the more we understand that this is a really big deal. It goes well beyond what we thought, where we thought it would be.
I'm curious where or what you would change if you had some sort of overarching power over the healthcare system. Like, where would you spend your time trying to fix things? Would it be, removing glyphosate from the food system, or would it be, trying to lean into more organic, real foods? I'm sure there's plenty of answers, but if you were given the almighty power to be able to focus on 1 or 2 things, what sort of things would you be focusing on?
That's a good question. I think food would probably have to be the first one, just because it's something we do every day, most of us at least, and multiple times a day, is eat. And if you're eating something that is hostile to your immune system, or that's provoking or triggering a hyperactive immune response, then just the frequency of that is going to make a big difference. And I think it's also the factor that affects the greatest number of people. Yes, environmental toxin accumulation is an issue, but it's not necessarily an issue that rises to the level where it could cause autoimmunity for the same number of people that for whom food is, triggering or provoking autoimmunity. And I would probably say the same thing for, virtually all of the other influences. They're all very significant, but food is probably the most common. And then, of course, food is related to the gut. What we eat influences and determines our gut health, which then in turn becomes the predisposing fact. Leaky gut or disrupted gut microbiome become predisposing factors for autoimmunity. So yeah, it starts with food, and for many people that might be enough. For some, they might need to take additional steps above and beyond that to address their issue.
Yeah, so food is a huge lever that you would pull, and an incredibly important lever at that. You made me think, Chris, when I think about the theme of this show, I would say regeneration is a theme that comes to mind pretty prominently. And I'm not just talking about regeneration of the soil. A lot of the regenerative farmers have been some of our favorite guests, but I also think in terms of the regeneration of health. And I think we've been amazed, 270 plus episodes of doing this, how many guests that have come on the podcast that have formerly been affected by chronic disease, autoimmune disease, et cetera. And by taking autonomy over the foods that they're putting into their system, different lifestyle practices, et cetera, they've proven that this body is an incredible piece of machinery, and the body is actually capable of healing and restoring itself to the health that you ultimately deserve. When I was doing prep for this podcast, I didn't realize that your health journey was actually spurred by a decade-long battle of chronic disease. And Chris, if you're comfortable sharing it, I would love to just learn a little bit more about what that journey was like for you. What type of chronic disease did you have, and what types of things did you start doing from a diet and lifestyle perspective that really helped you turn the page and get that health that you deserved as well?
Yeah, sure. I've talked about it a lot publicly, so I don't mind at all. I was traveling in my early 20s. I'm a surfer, and I set out to travel around the world for a couple of years, just surfing in different places. And I was in Indonesia, and I was on a little island called Sumbawa, and I was staying in a small village there, and tropical illness. You know, it was diarrhea, vomiting, delirium. I don't really even remember much what happened for 3 days there, and I was very, very far from any kind of medical care. And there was actually there was an Australian guy who was in the village at the same time as me, and he happened to have some antibiotics in his medical kit, and he gave them to me, and that's kind of what like brought me back from the brink, because apparently I was pretty close to the edge, and so that was like just got me back to a point where I could even get out of bed and try, make my way back to somewhere where I could get some kind of medical care diagnosis. But, so I went back to Australia from Indonesia, and very, very long story short, that turned into a decade-long process of trying to figure out what was going on, because there was the initial wave of in Indonesia, but then there was a whole set of things that happened after that, that were, like the consequences or the effect of that initial tropical illness. And so along the way is when I discovered a paleo / ancestral kind of diet, although at that time, this is, 25 years ago, it was not really, nobody knew what that was. There was probably Lauren Cordain talking about paleo and nobody else. And then I discovered also functional medicine, which again, 5 people had heard of at that point. Not the buzzword that it is today. And those were the 2 things that made the biggest difference in my own recovery. And so that's when I decided to, switch gears and go back and become a functional medicine clinician and help other people. I didn't set out to help people who'd been in similar situation, because my situation was a little bit unusual, but there were plenty of people who had complex chronic illnesses that were not well served by the traditional conventional medical system. Like yourself, you mentioned ulcerative colitis. That's a complex chronic illness that if you go to a conventional gastroenterologist, you're going to get steroids. You're going to get, as a first line therapy, if those don't work, you eventually go into the biologics like Remicade or Imurin, and firsthand where that road leads. But there's rarely anybody actually looking at what the root cause of that problem is and how to address that. And that's where functional medicine is really different. So that's what inspired me, just my own experience, knowing what it's like to suffer like that and not be able to get help, and then finally being able to recover through these tools.
Are you hopeful to potentially see the future of medicine start to take a bit more of a first principles approach and start to think through the lens of finding the root cause and diagnosing the root cause? Like, do you think that there's a path forward where there's more options for people to start to find functional medicine practitioners?
I have a kind of mixed assessment. So on the one hand, I've been incredibly frustrated with how slow the changes have been. My second book was called Unconventional Medicine, that I published in 2017, and it was a sort of manifesto addressing, highlighting a lot of the problems with the conventional medical system, specifically related to how it falls short with chronic disease. I mean, I think the conventional medical system is pretty amazing when it comes to trauma and acute emergency medicine care. If I have an injury or I get in a car accident or something like that, it's pretty remarkable what conventional medicine is able to achieve. And there's been some phenomenal innovations, antibiotics and lots of other things that have significantly extended human lifespan. So I'm not arguing that it doesn't have a place, but it just has not really been helpful when it comes to treating chronic disease. And the problem with that is that now 7 of 10 deaths are caused by chronic disease today, which is very different than like in the early 1900s. Most people were dying from acute infectious diseases like tuberculosis and pneumonia, so we're in a different place now than we were even just 100 years ago, and we need different tools, but the progress has been very slow for the medical model to change and adapt in a way that is better suited to functional medicine or to chronic disease. On the other hand, there have been some very positive developments. So there's now a Cleveland Clinic Center for Functional Medicine. Cleveland Clinic is a pretty well-regarded international institution. And to have that like rubber stamp of approval, that they have a Center for Functional Medicine is a pretty big deal. And there are a whole bunch of startups over the past 10, 20 years that were all like Parsley Health and Steady MD and a bunch of other, medical companies that are attempting to find ways of scaling functional medicine, or at least what I would call functional medicine light, which is, maybe not the full service functional medicine that you would get if you came to see me or someone like Mark Hyman or any number of functional medicine clinicians, but they're at least incorporating aspects of the functional medicine model into their care, and they're trying to do it in a way that's accessible to a broader number of people. The challenge, the fundamental challenge, guys, is that functional medicine by definition is highly individualized, and that means like we don't just apply the same treatment for the same disease in all cases. We will look at each patient individually, do testing, full history, and you might have 2 patients with ulcerative colitis who get totally different treatments because the cause is different in each case and each person requires a different approach. That's a very difficult model to scale. And that's just true. Objectively speaking, it's just true. It's much harder to scale something like that and make it accessible to the number of people that we have in this country than a model that's predominantly based around pharmaceutical interventions that are not individualized, that are really actually directed to a condition, right? So what I mean is like, if you have, our model is like, okay, so the patient has diabetes, you do this, this, and this. Then you do that for all patients with diabetes. And of course, there's some individual variation there, but not a lot, right? That's easier to scale because how much time do you really need in an interaction with the patient to get to the point where you can prescribe metformin or something like that? 10 minutes, 15 minutes? You don't need an hour. And that's what's going on. I guess what I would say is I understand and appreciate the complexity of it. And I don't know what the answer is, if I'm really honest. Like it's an intractable problem. And my book Unconventional Medicine proposed what I thought could be some answers for sure. But it's a really thorny and difficult systemic problem.
Yeah, it's interesting, Chris, to contrast this highly personalized approach with functional medicine versus this almost cookie cutter approach with Western medicine, because we've had a lot of people with IBD and ulcerative colitis reach out, and it seems like almost everyone has a similar journey where it's like they're prescribing Lialda. If that doesn't work, they're getting you on prednisone. If prednisone doesn't work, they're getting you on a biologic drug. And you're really told that diet and lifestyle doesn't have much to do with these things, and you need to stay on these drugs and can't get off of them because your body might develop some type of response to it and the drugs might not work anymore. And I saw these 2 divergent paths where my GI was telling me one thing, and then I was discovering, alternative diets like carnivore, animal-based, paleo, and I was feeling better and better. And I started seeing so many case studies of people online that were reporting that they were healing Crohn's and colitis through diet, and they were able to get off their medication. So that gave me the confidence to say, hey, can I get a colonoscopy? If I don't have any microinflammation, are you comfortable getting me off of this? He was willing to do it because I pushed the issue. But I think a lot of people are really it's almost like their doctor has all the autonomy and all the power, and they're scared to almost push back against the doctor. So you just made me think, what do you think the ideal doctor-patient relationship should look like, maybe from a functional perspective? I know you said very hyper-personalized, but what else in terms of like the ideal doctor-patient relationship do you think people should be thinking about?
Someone who listens, I think, is for sure the number one criteria that I would look for if I was a patient going to seek care. That's to me the defining characteristic of someone that's going to be open-minded and consider my experience in their, at least take my experience into their framework and make and include it as a factor in their decision-making process. I don't care whether they're a functional or conventional medicine provider. If you have a functional medicine provider who won't listen to you, don't stick around. If you have a conventional medical provider who listens very well, you still might need other care, but you're going to be in a much better situation there than if they're not listening at all. So I've often been disappointed and sometimes shocked by the lack of humility amongst medical practitioners, because the reality, if you look at the history of medicine, I've said this a few different times, but it's like the history of most people being wrong about most things most of the time. And, that's objectively true. You look at like what we knew 100 years ago, and we kind of chuckle and laugh about, all of the misconceptions and ideas that we had 100 years ago. They in turn, of course, looked back 100 years and laughed and chuckled at what those primitive people thought 100 years before. And yet somehow we think it's different now. Like we must have all the answers now. And 100 years from now, people looking back on us will for sure not be chuckling or laughing at our ignorance and what we didn't know. But of course that's wrong. Like they are going to be laughing and chuckling at our ignorance. But we, even knowing that and even having historical kind of proof of that, there's so much arrogance and ego in the medical profession. And I always learned so much from my patients, and in lots of different ways, like literally learning from them, like, oh, this thing that they researched, I haven't ever looked into that. Like, I want to learn more about that. I'm going to go look into that and and learn more, or learning in the sense of like, I really thought this was going to work because the research says it works, but I've tried it now 15 times with 15 different patients and it really doesn't work the way the research says. So I better revise my kind of thinking about that, So I think just having an open mind and listening, being willing to listen, are probably two most important things to look for if you're a patient looking for a clinician. And also the two most important qualities to embrace as a if you're a healthcare professional yourself.
What do you think the cause of the reluctance to just question the status quo in the realm of, the medical system? It feels like, probably prior to COVID, it was very uncommon for people to be really standing out on the edge and saying anything that was against kind of the traditional medical consensus. And now I think there's been a shift where it seems like more and more people are willing to put their necks out there. But what do you think is the cause behind that the reluctance to go against the grain?
Well, if you stick your neck out far enough, it's probably going to get cut off, or at least people are going to try to do that. And I don't know. I mean, I actually think things have swung back the other way, to be honest. I think there was a lot more challenging of dogma prior to COVID. And then I think COVID flipped some kind of switch that people went back into being a lot more conservative. And like, I'm not going to name any names, but I can think of a fair number of fairly high profile people in the like functional medicine, integrative medicine space that have really sort of become much more conventional in their approach over the past few years. I don't know that COVID has anything to do with that per se, but I think there was a shift in the in the in the climate. And I mean, this is even evidenced in like Google algorithm changes that started to completely deprioritize content sites that talk about anything that is not non-conventional. So, you know, you just think of my website in 2013 was getting over 1 million visits a month after I published my first book. And that just dropped precipitously with every Google algorithm update. Was that because people became less interested in what I was saying? Not at all. It's because Google decided that WebMD and Healthline and all of these other conventional sources were what people needed to be seeing. And so that's what they see. And it's not just me, it's pretty much every, you know, functional, holistic, integrative author, educator that you have heard of. That same thing happened over the last 10 years. So I actually tend to think things have become more conventional in recent time, and that's largely driven by a few multinational corporations being in charge of who sees what with the algorithms. But if we look back a little further, and still, of course, now this happens, you know, challenging the status quo. Like you guys understand this, there's an evolutionary pull to fitting in, because from an ancestral perspective, we lived in these close-knit tribal social groups. And if we fit in, we were more likely to survive. If we stood out in any way or challenged the traditional dogma in any way, we were more likely to be sort of, you know, either actually or metaphorically excommunicated from the tribe, and then that presents a survival challenge. So I think it's that deep in our nervous system and limbic system that to challenge the status quo is actually in some way a threat to our own survival. Whether it is an actual threat, you know, it rarely is, but it's perceived that way. So I think that's what makes it challenging.
Yeah, Chris, there definitely is this general looming fear amongst the alternative health community of censorship and getting deplatformed. I would say we really haven't had any concerns on Twitter or X. That's actually our biggest platform. We've never been censored on there, which is amazing, but we've definitely seen it on, you know, Google and Meta and things like that. What we've just tried to do is just control what we can control and just build out our email list and just, you know, control the controllables. And I'm curious for you, as someone that was getting 1 million hits a month, it seems like that dropped due to censorship and algorithm changes. Are there any other things that you'd recommend for the creators in the alternative health space that want to just be able to, you know, own their audience and try and hedge their bets as much as possible?
Yeah, I think email is really critical, like you mentioned. At least so far, that's been difficult for the gatekeepers to get to and manage. I think X also, you know, Elon Musk is a polarizing figure. People love him or hate him, but I admire at least the extent to which he's gone to make it an open platform where, you know, different voices are welcome. And, you know, of course that can present challenges, but I think it's very important for us to have venues, both online and offline, where we can express differing views and have conversations about that. I actually don't think that democracy is possible without that. It's that fundamental. And so, you know, any ways that for creators, you know, if you can gravitate towards platforms like that, where there's less likely to be any, you know, way of just shutting down your voice, then that's a good thing. And then, you know, just building a relationship with people via email is a really good way to do it, because that's a more direct line of communication that can't be as easily mediated. I mean, we would have days where we would just wake up and 40% of our traffic would be gone overnight from a Google algorithm change, you know, and it was just like, that more than anything else made it obvious that it had nothing to do with people's actual behavior, because that kind of change is just not going to happen overnight and in one night. If people are losing interest, that's going to happen over time. It was a clear manipulation that was being done by Google and other big companies to prioritize conventional content. And so I don't know. I mean, I think I'm curious about how blockchain will impact things over the next 10, 20 years, because that does present another permission-based, another possibility of permission-based information sharing, where, you could have a secure platform where people can communicate and even like transact with small amounts of cryptocurrency in exchange for information, rather than an advertising supported model. Because I think that's one of the biggest issues, is when you have an ad supported model, then the algorithms are always going to optimize for content that's going to get people's attention, because they're selling the attention to the advertiser, right? And so that's not necessarily going to be the most truthful content or the most helpful content. It's just going to be the content that sucks people's attention in as much as possible. And then of course they become beholden to the advertisers. And so if there's, if Pfizer is spending however many hundreds of millions of dollars on advertising on a particular platform, then that platform is just by definition going to be less likely to publish any content that is critical of Pfizer. That there's, as Upton Sinclair said famously, that it's difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary is dependent on him not understanding it. So, right. That's human nature, and we have to recognize that.
Yeah, you bring up a really interesting point that we've touched on a little bit on the show before, but just this idea of centralization and decentralization as it relates to effectively every system that we have in place, whether it's schooling or the healthcare system or the farming industry. There's just there's tides of centralization, and then it seems like we have the potential to build a more peer-to-peer way of doing things. Like we had we've had some people in the Bitcoin space who talk a lot about just like peer-to-peer networks that you're able to transact directly with people without having to have any sort of advertisers come in between, or banks in between you and the other party. And it's fascinating to think about what could happen if, we do create an economy where there is more peer-to-peer support. Like there's podcast platforms that are now enabling podcasters to get directly compensated by their audiences. And I think that's a fantastic model where, people don't have to listen to ads. They can they're paying and supporting their favorite podcast through just streaming it through this platform. And
Patreon,
it's fascinating to see what could happen if enough people just get fed up. I think it just like that's kind of the break. It's like if enough people hit a breaking point and start thinking in this way, maybe there is some hope to these systems that right now seem pretty small and not really widely used. But I do like hold out some hope there and think that there's an opportunity for this whole part of the world that's like, I feel like we're kind of like on a small island screaming like, hey, but we need to make some big radical changes here, and the powers that be really have a system where it's really hard to make change happen.
Absolutely. And we have to try. I mean, that's what it all comes to. Whether or not it works, we don't individually have control over that, but I think we have to try. And I'm a big believer in blockchain technology as a potential route forward, and I invest in blockchain. It's something I spend a lot of time understanding, and I've been on the board of blockchain companies in the health space, and there's a way of people owning their individual health data and having control over it and being able to share it easily with other healthcare practitioners, instead of it being behind some kind of black box ERP or electronic medical record, EMR, EHR type of system that none of which communicate with each other, and stuff can, there's so many applications for that technology that all fall under that umbrella of what you were saying, of just more autonomy and control of your own information and data, and sovereignty, essentially, like being able to make decisions about your own health and your own health care, about your finances, about how you consume information, what kind of information you want to consume, how you share information. Those are democratic ideals, really. And what's kind of shocking to me is how far we've gotten away from that in the mainstream political narrative, where those ideas are seen as somehow like fringe or radical, whereas I'm pretty sure that the founding fathers would be huge fans of the potential of blockchain and what it could mean in terms of protecting individual rights and sovereignty.
Yeah, we've really normalized things that haven't been normalized. I remember, first learning about regenerative agriculture and moving to Texas from New York City, and just being so accustomed to buying meat from the grocery store, unaware of the fact that like that meat could have had 25 to potentially 50 touch points from, from the feedlot in Brazil to the time it hit my plate in the US, which is crazy to think about. And there's this amazing renaissance and convergence that's happening between the Bitcoin community in particular and the carnivore ranching space. And there's all these Bitcoiners that have kind of used Bitcoin as their gateway to get into nutrition. I think that's partially driven from the fact that these people they're really free thinkers, and they've kind of done the research to understand that the US monetary system is broken. And a lot of those same principles actually apply to our food system as well. And, Safe Dean wrote the Bitcoin Standard. He's been carnivore for 10 years, but you actually see a lot of Bitcoiners in Austin that will seek out a rancher directly with zero touch points, buy a quarter, half whole beef, and just choose to pay them in Bitcoin. And it's like a completely decentralized, beautiful transaction where you have a first name relationship with your rancher. They know you, they want to take care of you. And it seems like that's really what should be normalized, not just namelessly picking up a piece of meat at the grocery store where you have no idea, where it comes from or who raised the meat to begin with. So it's, just something that we've been seeing in Austin, and it's really cool to see.
Fantastic. Yeah, I do see a lot of positive signs there. And I think particularly younger generations are just more open to this, and think that it just makes sense to them kind of inherently, that that's the way things should work. So, I on the flip side, there, as you both know, there's some very powerful vested interests that are not particularly keen on the idea of decentralization and this the power moving out of these centralized authority in the hands of central authorities into people like you and me, just average folks. So it'll be interesting to see how it plays out, but I think there are lots of applications for the health space for sure.
Yeah, this schism that seems like has occurred where there's a cohort of people that's just really trying to approach this problem. You said it earlier, this systemic problem from a first principle standpoint, where it's like there's so much to pull back on the system that is making people unhealthy, that we almost need to take a whole new fresh look at reconstructing it. It's like almost beyond just like trying to put band-aids on it. When you have 60% of people eating ultra processed foods and 7 out of 10 people having chronic disease, where does that lead us to if we continue on this track? And I think if you ask yourself that question, you get some pretty grim outlook. So to me, it's like there's a cohort of society that's maybe it's uncomfortable saying this, but like a little bit stuck in that current way of thinking. But then there's this other branch that is trying to like completely reimagine what society could look like. And I wonder sometimes, is there such thing as reforming the existing system, or do we just need to completely rebuild it?
It's a really good question. And it's one that I grapple with a lot, at least in terms of the healthcare system, when I wrote my second book, because that was a call for change. And again, the honest answer is I don't know. I go back and forth on what is possible. There are days where I think, oh man, this thing is just so messed up that there's, you know, you see all the different ways that the special interests and conflicts of interest and misaligned incentives combine together to, it almost looks like it was designed from the ground up to not work, you know, like to create, was it Charlie Munger? He said, show me the incentive and I'll show you the outcome, right?
Yeah.
So it's like, if you have a whole bunch of misaligned incentives in a system like our healthcare system, where like there's no, you know, there's an incentive for clinicians to order expensive tests because that's, you know, if they make additional money when they do that, well, guess what's going to happen? You know, there's going to be a lot of unnecessary testing that's done that adds a lot of expense to the healthcare system. If you give drug companies the incentive and ability to sell drugs for as much as money as they want, what do you think is going to happen? You're going to have situations where an individual costs the healthcare system $2.5 million over a period of 6 years because they prescribed the most expensive possible drug that they could prescribe in that situation. And so there's so many misaligned incentives that the only way to change the system in such a way that it could be preserved would be to completely change the incentives. But then at that point, is it even the same system anymore?
Yeah.
You know, so that we're kind of splitting hairs maybe at that point in terms of just terminology, whether it's the same system by name, it's a completely different system in the way that it works at that point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a great.
I mean, I'll give you an example of a positive example, right? So there are companies in Aura Health and others. Have you guys heard of capitated payments or so in the healthcare system? This sounds kind of weird when you think about it this way, but like there's no incentive generally for doctors to perform well on an individual basis or collectively. So I mean, which is just weird, right? Like if you go and work for a company or you work as part of a division in a company, there are like performance metrics that you have to meet. And there, you know, if there's a particular division of a company that's not doing well or pulling its own weight, it'll probably be, you know, killed or reassigned or something else. But like in medicine, if there that has been lacking until recently. And so there's been some companies like Iora Health who said, look, if you give us a bunch of patients with prediabetes and we will do our best to reverse that, you know, reverse them to being not having prediabetes. And if we do that, we know we're going to save the healthcare system $14,000 a year per patient, because once a patient has diabetes, that's how much it costs. And that could go on for decades, right? So they say to an insurance company, if we meet that goal, you pay us this much. If we don't meet that goal, you don't pay us at all, or you pay us, you know, a lot less or whatever it is. If we actually exceed that goal, meaning like we take these people with full-fledged type 2 diabetes back to pre-diabetes, or even from pre-diabetes back to being like super great lab work and super healthy, you pay us more, right? So that's how this, all of a sudden there's totally different model of care there. It's like everyone's working towards the same goal. Like we don't want people to have diabetes, and the doctors are going to be rewarded better, more if they're more successful in reversing that condition. The patients are going to be better off. The insurance company is going to have to spend a lot less money over time. They'll be more profitable. I mean, that just makes sense, right? It's just like when I explain it to people, they're usually like, well, why isn't the whole system just work that way? So I think it's possible. it's not like there's no path forward or no way that it could work. But what you have to understand is in that model, there are a lot of people that are cut out that are currently making a boatload of money that will no longer make money. And that's where the difficulty arises, right?
Yeah, I mean, how much more likely would an endocrinologist be likely to prescribe a patient a low carbohydrate diet if they know that there's actually a chance to get paid by the insurance company? Probably a lot higher than if they're not, right?
That's right. Exactly.
That's encouraging. Chris, have you heard of this company called Crowd Health before?
No, I don't think so.
You would actually probably love their founder, Andy Schoonover. He's been on the podcast twice. They're based in Austin. They're a venture-backed company, and it's a crowd-funded alternative to healthcare insurance. So they have about
Right.
8,000 members, a lot big in the keto carnivore movement, a lot of Bitcoiners, a lot of libertarians. And I think you pay $99 to become a member. And so if I break my arm, you guys will both get hit with the notification.
Yep.
And you opt in a very small amount and the entire community covers it. And so that way it's like for people that are really healthy that still want some additional protection if they're uninsured, they really get that. And a lot of the members actually know each other. So like if I know Chris and something happens to you, I'm obviously way more likely to contribute and be a good member of the community. So between Crowd Health and Agora Health, I think that should give a lot of people hope that there are these disruptive alternatives that are coming out that really are aligning incentives the right way too. And it's encouraging to see.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a lot. I have faith in people in general. I have less faith in systems and bureaucracies, but I do have faith in people, and I have potential for really good changes come, and I also at the same time have an appreciation meaning recognition, not love, but appreciation for the depth of the entrenched interests, and who are very much in favor of maintaining the status quo. So it's kind of a simultaneous feeling of hope and excitement about the potential, and an understanding of like, okay, we got work to do. We got to roll up our sleeves and stick with this, because there are a lot of vested interests who don't want this to change in the way that we want it to change.
Totally.
And I think for me, just having a sober assessment like that is something that came to me over many years of trying to make change in this area, and actively working toward that on, both as an entrepreneur, as someone who started training company to train functional medicine doctors and health coach training program, and someone who's been active in this space in so many different ways. Like being clear-eyed about it, I think, is really important, because it always takes longer than we think it will or we hope it will. And if you don't go into it with realistic expectations, you can really quickly get burned out.
Totally. I really like how practical you think about the issues, the complexities, and also sprinkling in some hope there, where it's like, this is a multi-generational issue that got us here. So it's going to probably take us multiple generations to reverse course. But I really like how you think about it practically. I'm wondering too, Chris, how do you think about things like blood work and continuous glucose monitors, these technologies that kind of put the power back in the individual's hand to start making some changes? Are you interested in those types of technologies, and do you promote those in any way?
Yes, I am, with caveats. I think when they're used appropriately, and when you have someone, whether it's yourself or a clinician that can help you make sense of the data, they can be really useful. Typically, I've found that the utility declines over time. So somebody might wear a CGM, continuous glucose monitor, and learn a lot over the first couple of weeks. Like, oh, look at that! I had a glass of wine that totally spiked my blood sugar, or I ate some plantains, and wow, those just really skyrocketed my blood sugar. But sweet potato doesn't do that. Okay, now I know that. In the future, but after you've done that for a couple of weeks, the incremental value of continuing to wear one tends to decrease over time. And there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, there's no, that doesn't make it less valuable necessarily in my mind, because once you've gained those insights, then you can use them for the rest of your life. And of course things do change, like as you address underlying health conditions, your blood sugar regulation might get better. So you might find that if you were to continue wearing it or put it back on 6 months later, maybe you don't have that huge spike when after you've eaten plantains, you know what I mean? So there's still value in coming back to it, but yeah, I think it can be really helpful in certain situations. Like we used to do programs with at my old clinic, Berkeley Fire Department and other first responders in the Bay Area, and it was enormously helpful for them. Like these were men and women who were just living a hard lifestyle. Being a first responder is really difficult and challenging, and in a lot of cases they weren't yet fully aware of a lot of these factors and how they influence their blood sugar. And they got, this gave them a black and white, so to speak, report of like, oh, wow, look at what happened when I had that huge bowl of pasta and then drank 3 beers before I went to sleep. My Oura, in this case, it was like a Oura ring. We gave them Oura rings, and they also had CGMs. They got a chance to see like exactly how the choices they were making, and also not things that were imposed on them just by their work lifestyle. If they got a call in the middle of the night or whatever, like how that affected how all of these external factors were affecting their health and well-being. It was very enlightening for them and life-changing in a number of different cases. So I think in situations like that can be super helpful. The other end of that spectrum is people who just go too far, I think, and they've got a spreadsheet with every possible data point, and they're looking over that. They're just obsessing over every last possible trackable data point, and I think that can become excessive. And I've had not a lot of patients like that in my career, but certainly some, and I think that can be a distraction and just take away from just living our lives and having a well-rounded, balanced approach.
Sometimes I wonder if the goal of wearables should actually be to outgrow them over time. So like if you're right, so. If you have metabolic dysfunction, right, having a Garmin on for the first time and understanding what your resting heart rate is and the steps that you're getting and your caloric burn, I'm sure that's super helpful. But at a certain point, I would think like, I would hope I wouldn't have to rely on an 8-sleep mattress to be able to tell me if I got a good or bad night of sleep as well.
Exactly. Or the Oura ring is similar, it's just, and I think actually for most people that is what happens. And there's even this phenomenon, some people call it the top drawer phenomenon, or where the health trackers end up in the top drawer, in the junk drawer or whatever. And so like, people tend to be enthusiastic about them for the first few weeks, and then after they've worn them for some period of time, they begin to kind of be able to predict what they're going to say, right? Just like what you said, when you wake up in the morning, you're like, I haven't seen my what the Oura app is telling me, but I can probably predict what it's going to say with relatively pinpoint accuracy. Like it might not be exact, but it's going to be pretty close. And same thing with like heart rate variability and blood sugar and all of that stuff. But again, like, there's nothing wrong with that. Like if it's training people to be able to do that on their own without the assistance of one of those devices, then it served its purpose. It's probably not good for the LTV of those brands.
Yeah.
but which is why so many of them have gone to subscription models. But it's still a valuable service to provide.
Is there anything that you're looking into right now that it has you very has your attention and has your interest? Because going through your blogs and your articles that you have on your website, you have some of the best writing on a bunch of different more fringe types of topics. Like one of the ones that comes to mind for me was, I remember you did this amazing article on just water quality, and you did a bit of a deep dive on like just shower filters and why people should use a shower filter. I'm curious if you have anything like that that comes to mind that you've been thinking about. Like, I know mold is becoming more common for people to be thinking about parasites. So anything that you're doing a deep dive on now that's interesting to you?
Yeah, good question. I mean, because of Adapt Naturals and how much my focus is there, a lot of my free time right now is going towards formulation of supplements, which, my whole career arc has been oriented around trying to have the biggest impact that I can have. And, I started as a clinician just treating patients one-on-one. And if we did, I forget what the name of this framework is, but it's like a T where like this part of the T is depth and this part of the top of the T is like breadth. One-on-one work with patients is deep. You can really profoundly impact, sometimes even save individual lives, which is very meaningful and rewarding. And I loved that work for many, many years. But there's obviously a hard limit to the number of people that you can have that kind of impact on. And so over time, I started to get interested in how can I expand that impact to a larger number of people. And then, I launched a clinician training program in 2016. We've trained over 600 doctors in 32 countries in functional medicine with an ancestral perspective. And then I launched, but again, even there, like that's a drop in the bucket, right? I'm proud of what we did, but 600 doctors, they'll go on and see 2,000 patients in their lifetime or more. That's a substantial impact, but we know that only a small fraction of people are going to be able to access one-on-one functional medicine care because it's expensive and it's not integrated into the healthcare system for the reasons we talked about before. So then I launched a health coach training program, and the idea there was that more people would be able to access health coaching because it's lower cost, and health coaches can be trained more quickly and easily because you don't need to have medical training in order to do it. And the supplement line is really kind of the latest step in that process of trying to translate my clinical experience into something that more people can access. And there's just so much junk in the supplement space. And I know this probably is better than anybody given my background and how much exposure I've had to the supplement industry through being a clinician and kind of knowing where all the bodies are buried, so to speak, in that industry. And I just wanted to create products that people could really trust and that had evidence-based, clean ingredients that actually work and move the needle, because so many supplements don't, as I'm sure you both know. So yeah, that's most of my time now is spent reading research. I'm just always looking at recent papers and trying to stay totally current and ahead of the curve in terms of what we know about how these various ingredients can be leveraged to improve our health and extend our lifespan and longevity.
I would have to imagine for you it's really fun formulating, because I would think that with all the experience you've had, I'm sure you've had all these ideas of like, oh, if only this supplement existed, or if only that supplement existed. And I'm sure there was also this question of, why am I going to like affiliate or work with a brand where like maybe they have good products, but they're not 100% in line with my standards? When now with the beauty of the internet, it's like I can create my own brand, do all the formulating myself, and put something out into the market that's truly best in class, right?
That's such a good insight. That's really actually why I decided to create my own supplement line in a nutshell. I got so tired of compromise. And it's not to say that, look, there are a lot of pretty good products out there. But it got irritating, to be honest, over many years of having to like compromise on this thing and then on this thing. And like, oh, that one's almost right, but not quite. And I would do this differently if I could really formulate my own, or that one is close, but it doesn't have this. And oh, now I need to I want my patient to take all 3 of these different ingredients, but shoot, there isn't a product that has all 3 of those ingredients. So they have to now take 3 different supplements when it could easily be one. There's so many decision points like that. And now you're right. It's super fun. Like with our most recent 2 products that we launched this year, one was BioVail Omega Plus, and it's a perfect example of what I'm talking about. So why do most people take fish oil? Well, one is if they're not eating fish or seafood in their diet and they're just trying to replace that as a nutrient. But another is they might have muscle or joint discomfort or mobility issues or post exercise inflammation, or maybe issues with skin, hair, and nails, or just kind of youthful appearance, vitality, etc. But there's so many crap, rancid, oxidized fish oils on the market that like 90% of them aren't worth taking. So that's number one. But then the way I think about it is like, we know why people are taking this. So why not add a couple of other ingredients that support and extend those benefits even further? And so I added the most bioavailable form of curcumin on the market, Novasol. It's 185 times more bioavailable than standard curcumin preparations. And then Nigella sativa, which is black seed oil. These have incredible metabolic, cardiovascular, brain and cognitive benefits, skin, hair, and nails. A lot of the same benefits are in the same category as fish oil, but there's no other product on the market that has all 3 of those ingredients in it. And so if you wanted to take all of those at the full dose that you would need to benefit, you had to buy 3 separate products and spend all that money. And so it was super fun for me to be able to put those all in one product, 2 gel caps instead of like 3 different bottles, and make that work. And then we just did the same thing with colostrum. We launched BioVail Colostrum Plus, and that has colostrum from 100% pasture raised, grass-fed cows, never given hormones or antibiotics, cold processed, all the good things you would expect. But then it has lactoferrin and beta glucan in it, which are 2 other ingredients that powerfully support the gut and the immune system, which is why people take colostrum, right? So it's been really fun. And like I spent months researching and developing both of those products, and it's really been satisfying to see the response and see how well they're working for people. And we had almost 20,000 customers this last year, which is in our first full year of operation. And the reality is, like, in my whole career of 15 years of treating patients, I probably have seen 1,500 patients. So, and we're just getting started. Like this year, I think we're probably going to have more like 40 to 60,000 new customers. So it's like it's an exponential impact, and that's what I get most excited about.
That's so exciting, and it's really encouraging and just awesome to see you being able to expand into this new role and new phase of what you're trying to do, which is reach more people and have a bigger impact. So just want to give you an applause and say keep up the great work. We're obviously huge fans, have been consuming your content for a while, and just really enjoy all the information that you put out there. You put it out in a way that's really digestible and easy to consume, and always kind of at the forefront of what's happening. So just very appreciative of all the work that you do, Chris.
Well, Brett and Harry, it's been a pleasure talking with you. I love your show and appreciate you guys getting the good word out there, because we need more people to have access to this kind of information, and especially at a time where it's more difficult to actually get this information out there. I appreciate it. You guys are doing the hard work of making that possible, and really enjoyed our conversation.
We appreciate it, Chris. Thank you so much.